Hello, welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Carmen McGuinness. As you can see, I'm recording outside today because it's such a gorgeous day. I hope my neighborhood cooperates and it doesn't get too loud and ruckus out there. If you hear children calling their mummies, be assured it's not me. My kids are off with their dad right now. So those would be neighborhood kids calling their mummies, not me ignoring them. So today I'm going to talk about a model I propose as the 6-spoke wheel of recovery from toxic relationships. Now I know there's other models out there, so I want to be clear that I recognize them as well, and whatever works for you is best. But this one has worked very well in my practice. I've worked with several people now who have recovered successfully from toxic relationships. So I feel that it's well worthy of sharing here. It may help you in your own life, in your own recovery. And if you're a practitioner, it may help you in your practice. So let's go through this. So when you're in one of these relationships, it can be very difficult to get out. You may realize that something isn't right, but you don't necessarily know what to do to make it right. Sometimes you need instrumental help, a place to live, or a place to move him or her to so that you can stay where you are. You might need financial assistance. Sometimes it comes down to just simple things like one person took the furniture and somebody else needs furniture. So I entirely respect these instrumental needs. And of course, sometimes children are involved as well. So these are all very concrete and real needs. However, today I'm not going into any of these challenges at all, except for what I just said. These are completely individual and might require the services of a life coach, if you don't have a therapist, who will work with you on that level, or you may need an attorney. So I'm not here to advise you on any of the above. Today I'm going to focus on the stages of emotional recovery so that your healing journey is as pain-free as possible. So as you can see from what I've put up here on the screen, my model is a 6-spoke wheel. I feel the wheel model better describes the process. So as I go through each of the stages, imagine a circle like this with 6 spokes, and between each spoke is a stage in which to accomplish the goals of that particular stage. So stage 1, the stage of what I call awareness. And this is when you realize that something isn't right or wasn't right. You might realize it after the affair is over. But something's either wrong or was wrong. And this is when you realize that all those warning signs you pushed back were real and valid. So it's important, don't make the mistake of thinking that awareness is enough. It's not. And it's definitely not enough because of one thing, and that is, and this is hard for some people to accept, but in fact you are addicted. You are addicted to the idea that this was a perfect relationship. You're addicted to that perfect relationship, that it exists in one place and one place only, and that's your mind and heart inside of you. Just like realizing that you're an addict or an alcoholic isn't enough, there's a lot more that needs to happen here. You need to break that addiction to that idea that this was a perfect relationship. And we'll talk about that as we go through these stages. So stage 2 is what I call the ping pong stage. Now, some people have denial and anger together, and certainly I think I have another video up on healing when you lose a loved one. But when it's a toxic relationship and there's an addiction involved, this actually happens in one functional stage. And so you have denial and anger ping-ponging back and forth. And the reason they ping-pong is that both denial and anger are responses to the beginning of sorrow. Either of the two, whether it's anger or denial, will temporarily relieve your sorrow by replacing it with the negative reinforcer of temporarily withdrawing the sorrow. It goes away. And that's what we call in behavioral science a negative reinforcer. It is reinforcing because it took away something painful, in this case, the sorrow. Unfortunately, the sorrow is something that you need to go through. As you'll see, it's a later stage. So an example of negative reinforcement that most people can be in touch with is scratching your back relieves an itch. But in fact, if the itch is a rash, the itch is going to come back as soon as you scratch your back. So I think of the ping pong stage as being stuck in a kind of a loop. You look back when you're in anger mode. He was a jerk anyway. Just look at how he mistreated me. And then you look forward when you're in denial mode. Maybe he'll come back. Maybe we can work things out. So you stay stuck in this looking back and looking forward loop instead of actually moving forward. It's important to know that you must go through sorrow in order to heal. And only by letting go of this ping pong stuff are you going to start to do that. An emotional wound is very similar to a physical wound. The healthy skin underneath must regenerate itself in order for the wound to start to heal. And then, of course, not surprisingly, is that stage of sorrow. So once we let go of ping pong and we start to accept the sadness that's inevitable when we lose someone that we love, we start to heal. And in this stage, you stop relying on anger or denial to relieve any of the sorrow, and instead you give in to it. You let it wash over you and deliver its punishing effects. And that's part of the process. That's part of what stops you getting into another relationship like this and stops you going back to that person, because it becomes a punisher rather than a reinforcer. Very important. It's important to know it won't last forever as well. Sorrow won't last forever. Almost as soon as you stop fighting sorrow, it starts to subside. It's like, oh, well, that was easy. So notice the small differences every day. Notice that each day gets a little better, but there's work to be done in this stage too. It's not just going through time. There's more to it than that. Excuse me. I've been out in the sun today, so I'm extra thirsty. So this stage of sorrow is when you start to notice loneliness, rejection, or possibly fear. And it's important to know which of these starts to come up for you, because one of these is what we call the core childhood wound. So healing that, healing the wound of childhood, is what stops the larger cycle. This is what stops the cycle in which you are once again drawn toward another narcissist or sociopath. So let's stop here and talk about this a little bit. The core childhood wound occurred because something went wrong in childhood. One of your caregivers, or possibly both, did not provide for your needs in some way. It may not be because they were a bad person. It may be their own life circumstances. We're not talking here about them. We're not going to focus here about them. We're going to focus on your perception of it as a small child. And this is very important to understand. That wound exists inside of you as if you were a child, not as if you were an adult. So it's like you're addressing an old scar. So once you get that far, once you let sorrow start to happen and you start to notice what comes up for you, and you are quite certain that you have stopped ping-ponging, then you're in what I call the excavation stage. And this is really where you're ready to do that deep digging forensic work, let's call it. During this stage, you know the answer to what was my first wound. You know that you might not know exactly what happened, but you know that it's either fear or rejection or loneliness. You know now whether your first wound was one of these three, and you can move forward to start to dig a little deeper. You dig and you learn exactly who dealt you that wound, who trained you to be used in the way that this last narcissist used you in this toxic relationship. And often people face self-doubt and guilt in this stage. That's completely normal. I hear things like, I don't know for sure, but she was my mom, dad, whoever, and she did the best she could. Yes, it's important to understand that this isn't a hate activity. This isn't a blame activity. And often it's an activity of forgiveness. We are all doing the very best that we can. And we're not here to do any of this to cast blame, but merely to cast light and understanding, specifically self-understanding. And if the wound occurred when you were very young, often the best we can do is come up with a plausible working theory. I call this stage the excavation stage because it often has layers. And the layers are sometimes fragile and must be dug through very carefully. Many people really need a therapist or a coach who's experienced in this kind of work to help them through this phase. So once we start to have a plausible theory, once we have got to a point where we know what the first wound was, who dealt it to us, and the theories about how it happened, then we move on to self-discovery. And this is when you find your true self. You can't take away the experiences that hurt you, but you can reintegrate them into your life now that you've processed them in the previous stages. So in the self-discovery stage, you'll write your personal narrative. This is where you're really going to let go of what Robert Firestone and his daughter Lisa Firestone call the fantasy bond. This is where you're going to let that go and create a personal narrative that allows for the imperfections in your childhood and doesn't sugarcoat them. I have a video example of this, and I will put up a link so that you can click right to it, but first finish this video. This stage, this self-discovery stage, might also include some cleaning house. You may, as you start to get into this a little deeper, find that some of your friends and coworkers are also using you in that old, familiar, unhealthy way. It's like you become a whatever that thing is magnet. You might experiment with reclaiming your power in those relationships as well, versus possibly even just getting people out of your life entirely. So often with work people, bosses in particular, you can't necessarily get them out of your life, but you can start to put up boundaries in those relationships. Stop giving them power over you. But with friends, you can just literally clean house. If you have a toxic friend and you identify the same patterns that you had with that toxic ex, then it might be time for new friends. So this activity will also prove useful to you when you start dating. Think of it as practice, because you will start dating again, and you're going to need to be able to notice those patterns. So, and that's stage 6, what I call re-entry. And this is a stage when you start to date again and you get out there. And maybe at first it's not dating, maybe it's just getting out there. Hopefully a good long while has gone by before you get to this. I want to say at least 6 months. And for some people it can be a year or more. I know many of you know some of my story, some of my history. I have been in these toxic relationships, 3 marriages, 2 boyfriends that I've identified as these sorts of gentlemen. And for me, after the last one, which was my last boyfriend, it took me a good 15 months, actually as long as the relationship, before I felt that I was ready to start dating again. And of course, once I felt ready, the universe started to bring people into my circle, and you know, things improved dramatically. So if you've cleared out some of your friends, it's also a time to start making new ones. So get out and about. So I describe this as a stage because it shouldn't be viewed as a result. Yes, in many ways, each of the stages is a result of the last, but thinking of any one of them as completion is quite dangerous. It's important to always analyze where you are right now today, how you're doing, and if you slip back into a relationship with a narcissist or some other bad boy, it's important that you recognize it and realize that you're once again in that awareness stage. So if you catch it in time, when that happens, you won't need to go through the ping pong stage of anger and denial again. You can give that a pass entirely. And that's why I use a wheel for this model. You can skip off the wheel, skip the anger and denial, and jump back on at excavation or self-discovery, because chances are you missed something the last time around. And I've done this work. I've done it twice myself, and I've had to repeat it with clients sometimes. So it's important that you have that structure and continue to trust yourself as you move through this. And often I find that self-trust is the biggest challenge when people feel that they're done with the wheel. Trusting yourself to get out and about, trusting yourself, you start to see the signs everywhere. Oh my gosh, he's a narcissist. He said this, he said that. And certainly sometimes people, especially when the relationship is new, say silly things. So trust yourself to be able to feel through this. I find that, you know, telling people to trust other people is maybe not the best idea at this point. Trust yourself first to decide who to trust. But even before you start to trust yourself, before you just let go and say, I can do this, I've got this now, start with trusting the universe. You know, I find that many of the people I work with have just lost trust in destiny and fate. They've lost trust that the world has anything good to give them. So maybe start with that, and then move on to trusting yourself, and then start to dole out trust to a few other people. So I certainly hope this has been helpful. I've enjoyed making it. I think these are such important things for people to understand and be able to do in their life. As always, if you need help, if you need additional help other than what you're finding on the internet, I do have an internet-based interface that is HIPAA secure, where I can meet. I'm credentialed to practice in about half the states, so call me. There are links in the About section. So I look forward to hearing from people who do need additional help. Thank you for tuning in today. I hope the rest of your day is amazing.